Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started. It's past time to get started. Grab your Bibles, turn to Joshua chapter 1. I want to start there this morning. Joshua chapter 1. We're getting to the end of the book of Joshua. I want to do a little bit of reflection before we jump into our study here in Joshua 22 today. So if you remember at the very beginning of the conquest, Joshua takes over, God comes to him and he says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. I am with you. I'm with you wherever you go." And if you remember Joshua took that confidence as any great leader should. He took that confidence and he passed it on to the people, didn't he? He went to the people and he said the exact same thing. Be strong and courageous. And throughout the conquest, what's he been telling the people? Be strong, courageous. Don't be afraid. God is with us wherever we go, but we've got to walk with him. We've got to obey him. Now, as he began there in Joshua chapter 1, if you remember, before the conquest began, Joshua did something very critically important, and that is he consolidated the interests of all the tribes together. Specifically, as is going to be important today in our study, there were these tribes that had taken an inheritance on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Do y'all remember that? The Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, when they defeated Og and Sihon, those giant kings, they looked at this land and they said, "We like this. We want to stay here. This place is great." But that posed a problem for the people of Israel. Because what that was going to do is that meant they were going to be separated from one another by this very distinct boundary right down the middle of them, the Jordan River. And if you remember that episode in Joshua, when they crossed the Jordan, that was no small feat to cross the Jordan River. So it was a very definite boundary. It was something that was going to divide this nation. And Joshua, it seems either he was divinely inspired to do so or he was thinking ahead as a leader. He thought, I need to make sure we are all unified in this mission as the people of God, because the promises of God were not simply, I'm just going to give you some land, good luck finding it. It is, I have a land prepared for you that I am going to give to you, right? The land of Canaan. He very specifically defined the boundary lines of the land that he was going to give them. And the fact was, where these eastern tribes wanted to settle, that was not within the boundary lines. Okay, so that was going to keep them outside of the promised land and had potential to create some issues, as we're going to see today. So from the very beginning, Joshua chapter 1, if you remember, Joshua came to them. Joshua 1, beginning in verse number 12, specifically to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, "Remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock shall remain in the land that Moses gave you beyond the Jordan. But all the men of valor among you shall pass over armed before your brothers and shall help them until the Lord gives rest to your brothers as he has to you. And they also take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving them. Then you shall return to the land of your possession and shall possess it, the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise." So his charge to them was, yes, I know you've got a land of your own that has been promised to you. But because you are part of the people of God, it is still your responsibility to help the people of God conquer the land that God is giving to them. And so he charges them. You need to come with me. You're going to be fighting for a land that is not going to be yours technically. But this is something that we do together because we are the people of God. That's Joshua's message to them. And if you remember right here in Joshua chapter 1, they said, we're with you. All that you've commanded, we're going to do it. We're going to fight with you. We're going to travel with you. And for 7 long years during the conquest, that's what they did. They left their wives and their children. By the way, this answers your question. They left their wives and their children and their little ones at home. They're out fighting for 7 years plus. And now as we get into Joshua chapter 22, the conquest is completed. And Joshua comes to them and he affirms their faithfulness. You have done what you said you would do. Look with me, Joshua chapter 22. This is where we're going to be making our study from today. Joshua chapter 22, at that time Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days down to this day. Notice how emphatic he is. He is recognizing you've done exactly what you said you were going to do. You have been faithful not just to us, but to God's mission for God's people. These are important words that Joshua is saying. You have been careful to keep the charge of the Lord your God. Verse number 4, and now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers as he promised to them. Therefore turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. And so they were committed, provably so, to the mission of God, to the people of God for these many years, to fulfill his promises through them. And now that task is complete, and he sends them home to go back. You can imagine, I would be so thrilled. You know, you're at a place, finally I get to go home. And so Joshua sends them home. But before he does, he has some things to say to them. And I ask you on your question sheet, question number 1, what does Joshua say to them before they go? What are some of the things that he encourages and admonishes them with? Say it again.
Make up their mind.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
To make a choice.
Okay, so make a choice who they're going to serve? Yeah, absolutely. So he gives them this very similar charge that we've seen all throughout the book of Joshua. And he's going to say again in Joshua chapter 24, you need to make sure you choose to serve the Lord your God. And so he's giving them this charge, right? This charge to go and to follow and to serve God. Okay, what else does he say? Anything specific?
Keep the law of Moses.
That's right. He draws them back to what faithfulness really looks like. For the people of God, faithfulness means obedience. Faithfulness means we adhere, we listen to what God has to say. I especially appreciate you. Just look here in verse number 5. Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. I think this is what Jesus would call the first and greatest commandment, right? That sounds a lot like it. But I really appreciate how the language that Joshua uses. He doesn't just say, hey, you need to obey God. He recognizes the limitations of humanity, right? You've got to really cling to God. You've got to make some efforts here. Especially, think about what Joshua's looking at. These 2.5 tribes are about to separate from the people of God. He knows it's going to be difficult for them. And so he gives them this admonition and this reminder. They must choose, as Linda said, to cling to God when they go back. Dennis?
And it goes deeper than just saying, obey the king.
That's right.
It goes deeper than that because,
Sure.
You will have kings in the future and people will obey them just because they're a king. But he's saying it's more that you've got to love your God.
Yeah.
In order to serve him, you have to love him.
Yeah. I think it's important to note in all this too, though. He doesn't just charge them and give them an admonition. There's a very positive element to it as well. There's a blessing, right? In fact, in verse number 6, so Joshua blessed them and sent them away. And he's going to say in verse number 8, go back to your tents with much wealth and very much livestock, with silver, with gold, bronze, and iron, and very much clothing. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers. He's saying, earned is not the right word I need to say here. He's saying this is the fruit of your obedience to God, right? This is what God has given to you as a promise for your faithfulness. This is what covenant relationship looks like. And so it's not just the negative, it's also the positive. And I want to bring this up because that's a very important balance as we walk by faith, right? That's a very important balance. We've been given a charge and we need the constant reminders towards obedience and faithfulness. But we also need the settling that faithfulness to Yahweh's mission is always rewarded. Let me just share with you a couple of New Testament verses, and then I'll get your comment, Nick. Romans chapter 2 and verse number 10. There will be glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good. That's a promise from God, right? That's a reward from God, but that's also a charge. We have to live good. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse number 10. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. You see, we have a charge as the people of God with a hope, with a blessing, with a promise that God has in front of us. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse number 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Nick, go ahead.
A little bit of a rabbit trail, but not a far-fetched.
talking about Calvinism with this is that you would think that when you're talking about the land that was promised to them by Abraham, that would be something that they could count on, but rather it was a choice that God was continually asking them to make and to re-emphasize the covenant that God had made with them. Choose you this day.
Yeah.
Who are you going to serve?
Yeah.
And it made a difference then, makes a difference now.
Yeah. Well, and it's so important, I think, to see the contrast between the generations as well. Isn't that what Hebrews does? Because the calling of God, the promise of God is irrevocable, right? He's going to give this land to Abraham's descendants. But one generation chose not to accept it. And another one did. And that's what Hebrews 3 and 4 is really all about. It's saying, look at this example. We studied the Exodus generation. We've now studied the conquest generation. And we see two very different outcomes. One took hold of the promises of God, and one of them failed in the wilderness, and they died in the wilderness. They didn't make the journey, you know. And that's such an important conversation just within our faith. It's supposed to keep us motivated, right? We learn from the past generations. We don't repeat their mistakes. We press on toward the goal for the prize, right? And that's the language that Paul would say in regards to our faith today. Jim?
Just in your Romans 2nd passage, in verse 6, he says, "He will render each one according to his works, with those who by patience and well-doing seek glory and honor and immortality, and eternal life. But those who are self-seeking do not obey him. Theirs will be wrath and fury." Therefore, when he gets to this verse we're talking about, there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil. Jude verse 3, but glory and honor and everyone who does good. It doesn't look, I mean, he's not talking about here, I promise.
Sure.
He's talking about the next one. There is a promise of rest on the other side. Here are people, this is the rest he told them to go get. And he gave them something for it, right?
That's right.
It is exactly the shadow of what we get when we cross Jordan at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such great. And then again, Hebrews 4 says if Joshua had given them rest, he wouldn't have had to promise a better rest. Right? And God is promising us a better rest. Like you said, these were all shadows and figures of our faith today. We're not looking for a home here, right? In fact, Hebrews 11 says, really none of these people were looking for a home. People of faith weren't looking for a place of rest here. They're looking for a place with God, to be at peace with God. And this was a limited view of that. But it gives such hope in what we have to come because we have a better leader, right? We don't have Moses who died. We don't have Joshua who died. We have Jesus, whoever lives and stands in the presence of God, who leads us in triumphant victory. I think that's how it ends. So great stuff there. Any other thoughts along those lines? Appreciate those comments.
What's your thought about this clean? You know, he says, I want you to be careful to observe the laws, but he says, I want you to clean. What was that?
I mean, I think that's obedience. But I mean, it's a deliberate choice of the will. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, clinging is such vivid imagery. I think it's intentional there. John, you have a thought there?
I was going to say that the American Standard Translation says hold fast.
Hold fast, yeah.
And to me, it's that same idea. We have a choice. You know, God is always there. We have a choice of whether or not we're going to hold fast to Him or just drift around.
Well, I think all this is driving us towards Joshua's final comments in Joshua 24, those words that many of us hear, you know, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's a deliberate choice of the will. It's really where the rubber meets the road, right? God has done all of this and given them this land, right? Nothing that they deserve. That's grace. That's grace. But you still have to choose if you're going to walk with Him. And that's made very evident as you get into the book of Judges, right? When you fail to make that choice, all of this stuff goes away. Right? All this stuff goes away in very terrible, terrible ways. It's not just an absence of it. It's complete 180 in a different direction. Yeah. I want y'all to notice the detail here in verse number 7, Joshua 22 and verse number 7. So Joshua has blessed them and he's sending them away. It says, now to the one half of the tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan. So that's east of the Jordan. But to the other half Joshua had given a possession beside their brothers in the land west of the Jordan. And when Joshua sent them away to their homes, and blessed them, he said he had some other things to say to them. But I want you to think about why this detail is here, because I think this detail is included at this point in Joshua 22 to kind of clue us into what is coming. He's making us very aware of what I just said. So their choice to take an inheritance east of the Jordan is going to divide this family, right? It's going to divide the tribe of Manasseh, okay? And that has potential to be a very negative thing. When families divide, when families are separated, what happens, right? Misunderstandings happen a lot easier, right? Distance has a way of kind of clouding our understanding of what is real. And if you read ahead, I mean, you know, conflict is around the corner. That's what we're about to study here in just a minute. And so their choice to have this inheritance is causing some angst on both sides. In fact, we'll read a little bit later in verse number 24, the eastern tribes were afraid that they were going to be estranged and even thought of as, no, you're not part of Israel anymore because of this choice that you had made. And I'm not sure the text is telling us that their decision is right or wrong, just that human nature is that we're affected by separation, right? It impacts us, right? The more time you spend away from people, the less you know them, the less aware you are of their intentions, their choices, even when things have been nothing but good, right? And things have been nothing but good here, right? Now, perhaps this is an admonition for us to be eager to maintain unity. Isn't that what the New Testament scriptures say? And to think the best of one another, because the fact is conflict will arise incidentally from misunderstanding, but that doesn't mean that there are ill intentions always. In fact, that's what I think we're going to see today. Sometimes misunderstandings happen and we've got to work them out. We've got to understand that they can happen, but we can work them out, and there's a way to work them out. And I think we're given a really good pattern in our text today. In fact, I would argue that really with familial expectations come conflict, but also the means and ability to resolve conflict. We'll get to all that more in just a minute. So you've got these tribes. Let's kind of lay the story out. You've got these tribes. They're heading east, right? So they leave from Shiloh. I should have put a map up here for you. By the way, I don't have any slides today for you. I thought I'd keep it simple. We're just going to look at the Word of God today. Is that okay with y'all? But Shiloh is right about in the middle of Canaan, and they just start heading east towards the Jordan River. And they stop. It says in verse number 10, look with me, Joshua 22 and verse number 10, when they came to the region of the Jordan, that is in the land of Canaan, the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size. And the people of Israel heard it. The people of Israel heard it, said, behold, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built the altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan in the region about the Jordan, on the side that belongs to the people of Israel. Now, you see how things are already starting to heat up? They're starting to already make sides. Hey, they're on our land. They didn't inherit this. And they're building something here that we're not real happy about. Verse 12, and when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. You've got a brand new kingdom that's about to go to war with itself. And why? Because somebody heard that somebody did something and they weren't happy about it. Now, I'm kind of intentionally painting it a certain way because I want you to kind of see there's a little bit of hearsay involved here, isn't there? There's a report, but there are some things that are very relevant to this report that are very important. So let me ask you this. So they build this altar. What do we know about the altar? We're going to read a little bit more about the intentions behind it. But what do we know just from verses 10 through 12? What do we know about this altar? Okay, it's not just big, it is imposing, it says. I want you to imagine what that would look like in here. If something was of imposing size, I mean, it would take up it would be obnoxiously huge. Like, you cannot miss this thing, right? So if I'm one of the Western tribes and I see this, I'm starting to think they have done something that is very obvious, right? They're not building this thing in a corner, right? It is obvious. It is huge. They have taken time to build this, right? Okay. What else do we know about this altar?
It's on the frontier.
Okay, it's on the frontier. Why does that matter?
West side.
Again, it's on our territory, and we are the people of God, and if you want to do that, go to your land, not on our land, right? There's some accusatory thoughts going on here. Okay? What else do we know about it? Anything? What about this? What are altars used for?
Sacrifice.
Worship, sacrifice, right? In fact, that's going to be some of the arguments that they make. So why, if you're a Western tribe and you're seeing Israel build this, or the Eastern tribes build this massive altar that is used for worship and sacrifice, you might be thinking, there's something not right here. There's something that they're doing, and I don't feel comfortable with this at all. And not only that, they're doing it on our property. I don't feel good about this at all. You can see how the nature of this report would arouse some suspicion, right, at the very least. And I think it's important to accept that, because they weren't being unreasonable. They weren't being irrational. They're seeing something that is, in their minds, ungodly. And it needs to be dealt with, right, on our land. And as we're going to get into, they're going to say, we've been through this before. We're not making God mad. I don't want to do this again. This is a valid contention that they have. Hence why they would respond so quickly. And it says there, they gather together to make war. They're not just going to sit by and watch this happen. If you're going to divide from us, you're not just going to divide from us. You're going to be destroyed, because this is not okay. This is not okay. Now, perhaps this was a fair reaction to some extent, based on what the information that they had. But as we see this play out, we're going to get more information given, aren't we? We're going to understand a little bit more about why these tribes built this altar and understand the circumstances. But at this point in the story, I just want us to see how a secondhand report with limited information impacted their relationship. Right? Things heated up pretty quickly, didn't they? They went from peace to we want to kill you. Like that. Right? Does that ever happen in your life? I don't know about killing. Okay, that's a little extreme, but I mean, when circumstances happen where there's misunderstanding, tempers flare up, right? People get very single-minded, where you were thinking this, very accusatory, right? It can very quickly escalate. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
And Christians are not supposed to do that to other Christians. We
have to be very, very cautious. And this is, I think, the lesson for us today, because you're talking about family here, right? And I think, again, that probably creates greater emotion sometimes when you're talking about family and dealing with family. But there were a lot of assumptions that were made here, weren't there? And that's a big deal that I think is important to see. The Western tribes were assuming some things about the Eastern tribes that just weren't true, that we'll find out. Even though they had a fair contention to say, this doesn't look right, can you explain this to me? Things escalated very quickly, and I don't know that they necessarily should have. And so let me just ask you this. When situations like this happen, what is the biblical wisdom for us? How should we respond to these sort of situations?
Go to your brother.
Think the best.
Go to your brother? Think the best of your brother? I mean, do you see how the Bible already kind of knows this is human nature? Right? It's not just the Old Testament folks, it's New Testament folks. And the verse I thought of was James 1:19. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Things heated up pretty quickly here, but thankfully, the Western tribes were smart enough to say, we need to go talk to our brethren. Right? They did that, didn't they? They said, let's send, before we go fighting them, before any shots are fired, they send a big delegation. Who do they send? Who do they send to go talk to them?
Phineas.
Okay, so they send Phineas. Anybody else?
And one priest per 10 other priests.
So 10 more people. I don't know if they're priests necessarily. They're heads of households for sure. Okay, so who is Phineas? Let me just ask you this to begin with. Y'all familiar with the story of Phineas? He's one of my favorite characters in the Bible, by the way. So again, he's the son of Eleazar, so he was the son of the priest, right? So this is a man who understands the charge of the holiness of God. In fact, he's demonstrated that. If you recall, Numbers chapter 25, we're going to look at that event here in just a minute. But in Numbers chapter 25, Israel was engaged in some things that were ungodly, unholy, that needed to be dealt with, and everybody else was kind of sitting to the side. And Phineas is the one that stepped up and did something about it. He's a man of action. And it seems to me he has that reputation. I mean, why else would they take him, right? I mean, maybe he's the son of the priest, but he's a man of action. He steps up when no one else will. So he's the right man for the job. And then on top of that, you've got these 10 other people who are defined as heads of tribes, heads of households, important people, right? So these aren't just some chumps like the spies that maybe went and spied out the land that were kind of driven by their whims, right? It seems to me that there's been a deliberate choice in who's going to go talk to these people. And I think that's really wise, because these are the right people that need to be having the conversation, right? Sometimes when conflict arises, the wrong people are having the conversation. You see, they've at least got the right people in the right places to go have these conversations. Okay, so they send them, and let me just ask this question number 2. Why were the Western tribes offended by the altar that was built? What rationale do they give?
Not at the tabernacle.
Okay, so it's not at the tabernacle. What do you mean by that? Or why is that important?
Well, that's where they were supposed to go to offer sacrifice. And
Right.
So, and also, I just think the size of it is probably, I think there's probably a reference to, it's kind of like the Canaanite altars, it's big.
For sure.
High. It's not the plan that God has given them for altars.
Yeah, so they know, these Western tribes are saying, we know we have a place to worship that God has given to us, and you're doing something different from that. You're using this in a way that's not right. Okay, so that's their big contention, right? This altar doesn't deserve to exist as a place of worship to God because that doesn't honor God, right? Wouldn't you agree? That's kind of the baseline of this.
They don't use the word, but it's almost idolatrous.
Yeah. Well, and it seems, so I ask you this too. They reference 2 events as they're making their contentions, right? So they reference 2 events. What were those 2 events that they reference?
Peor and Achan.
Okay, at Peor, that's the Numbers 25 event. What's the other one? Achan at Ai. So let's talk about those 2 events for just a minute because they're important for us understanding their contention. So at Peor, I already kind of alluded to this, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of summarize it. So that was a very destructive event that brought plague and death. The Israelites had, the Bible uses the word yoked themselves with the Moabites. They were engaging in idolatrous practices, right? They were chasing after their gods, the Baal of Peor, and obviously you know how God feels about that. And he sends a plague on the people. I mean, it's literally killing the people. And what he tells Moses to do, interestingly, he says, Moses, you need to go take the heads of the tribes, the heads of the household, and go hang them out in the sun for letting this happen. Now, this is after the failure of the previous generation. So I think some of this was judgment on the previous generation, in my opinion. But he's making a very clear point. The heads of the households have a responsibility to honor God, don't they? You see how that might relate to our situation now where the heads of households are gathering together and saying, I don't want to get hanged out in the sun again. We've seen this happen before. But that's what God told Moses to do. Hang them out in the sun. Go kill anybody that's chasing these other gods. Kill them. That's the command from God. And it seems like in that Numbers 25 passage, in my opinion, the people of Israel kind of drag their feet, but Phineas steps up. Phineas steps up and he says, enough. Enough. We're not, in fact, there's this couple. One of them's a Moabite, one of them's an Israelite. Children of the heads of households, mind you, that engage in blatant sexual immorality, go into their tent together, and he follows them in there and he kills them. Because he says, I don't care who you are. No one is going to disobey and dishonor God. That's not okay. And God makes a covenant with Phineas after that. A covenant of peace. He says, you've honored me. You've listened to me. You've regarded me as holy. Again, another reason for Phineas to be involved in this situation. But you can see how some of that kind of relates. Perhaps they saw they're going down this path of idolatry and we're not going there. Okay, let's talk about the other incident then. Achan and at Ai. What happened in that incident? Somebody give me the short version of that one. Okay, so God said there's things that are devoted to me, right? And Achan took some of those devoted things. And what was the outcome of that? Oh, he died. Right, he died. And his family. In fact, as they are referencing it here in Joshua chapter 22, they said, he didn't just die alone. His whole family died. We lost at battle. Don't you remember that? It was demoralizing. In fact, we studied that, didn't we? It was the people of Israel go, why? What's happening? And you remember what God said? There's sin in the camp that needs to be dealt with. There is a corporate responsibility that we have as the people of God. None of the other people had made those choices, but Achan had. And he was in the camp of God. And among the people of God, there's a different expectation, isn't there? Don't you see that? We were supposed to see that from the story of Achan, and it needed to be dealt with. And when they did, what happened? God comes back. God leads the people. They're victorious because they upheld his honor. They did what he said. And so, how do these 2 events help us, or help us understand what these Western tribes were feeling? John?
They refer to the building of the altar as rebellion.
Yeah, they do. That's
I
right.
think that's a big deal, because like these other two events, those were obviously rebelling against God.
Sure.
That, they felt like that was gonna cause them all to be in jeopardy.
Yeah. Well, and I think they say as much. I need to find the reference here. Verse number 19, but now if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land where the Lord's tabernacle stands. Take for yourself a possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord or make us rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of the Lord our God. You see what they're saying? Your choices are going to impact us. Because we're all the people of God, and God holds us all responsible together for upholding His honor. There's such an important lesson here about corporate faithfulness that we lose in our individualistic society. You know, people want to think, I can sit in my little bubble here, and my choices are my choices, and that's it. And I'm not saying that God will hold you responsible for anybody else's choices. Do not hear me say that at all. But as the people of God, the church of God, we have a responsibility, an obligation, a mission to be built up as a holy temple, a dwelling place for God. That's the language of 1 Peter. And when we allow impurity, unholiness, sin, known sin, to exist among us, what we are doing is we are corrupting that very identity as the people of God. And God would use the language of Deuteronomy, the language of the Old Testament, say, purge the evil from your midst. In fact, you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Y'all are familiar with that passage, right? 1 Corinthians 5, where the man is engaged in blatant sexual immorality. It is observable. It's verifiable. A lot like this altar, right? It was observable. It was verifiable. These aren't just vague allegations. They were dealt with because God's holiness was at stake. Because if they don't, they are not the people of God, and God is going to reject them. That's really their big issue. Is they're saying, we have learned from these past generations that if we don't uphold God's holiness, one, we lose our identity. Two, we lose God. And not only that, He comes against us. And it's not good, and we ain't going to be a part of that, right? That's kind of their position in all this. You think that's fair? You think that's a solid position to stand on? I think that's a position that some people might be afraid to take because of how contentious it is. But it was necessary because what was most important needed to be pushed to the front, right? I don't know what you're doing, but are you honoring God? Man, wouldn't that be a great question to ask ourselves, to ask one another? I don't know what you're doing, but is it honoring God? You feel good about that? That's where they have put this in front of the people. And so accusations have been made. Tensions are very high. How are the Eastern tribes going to respond to this? Well, look at beginning in verse number 21. Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
We're talking about this. That's why it's mentioned in the New Testament about the church, where there's times for church discipline that has to be taken place.
Sure.
And the reason for it is, if you look at it, because like the Corinthians, they accepted what was going on.
Sure.
And it affected the whole church in their relationship with God. And where you have the other person who has marked this brother, it's to show that you're dedicated to God. You're not going to let this influence affect the rest of the church.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. God wants us to be dedicated to Him. And when we allow things to happen, and we may not agree with it, we still allow it and accept it. It infects the church, and it affects the church in their relationship to God.
Yeah, great point. And again, it fundamentally comes back to understanding. Our identity as the people of God does not come from our own understanding, does not come from our own, it comes from the calling of God, right? We have been called to this, and if we're going to accept this, we can't just do it on our own terms anyway, willy-nilly that we think is best, right? We have to uphold a certain standard. In fact, you read that 1 Corinthians passage, and that's really his argument. We're different from the rest of the world. We don't hold other people accountable to this standard, right? We're different. We're notably different. If you don't want that, then you can't be part of the people of God. It's a very high calling. It's a walk that we must be worthy of. My friends, we got to take this very seriously. We've got to take holiness because we live in a grace-saturated environment, religious environment. Y'all know I love grace. I love to talk about grace. But it makes us miss the gravity of God's holiness sometimes, which is really lost. And that is so important. That's what makes us special, is adherence to a holy God standard, becoming like Him, different like Him. from the rest of the world. So important. So important. Yeah, appreciate those thoughts, Dennis. That really contextualizes church discipline, doesn't it? It's not just about pointing fingers. It's about pointing upward and saying him. I don't care what you think is right. I care what he thinks is right. We've got to get our fingers pointing in the right direction. I think that's a great point, Dennis. So these accusations have been made. How do these tribes respond to it? Yeah, go ahead, Noel.
I think it's interesting that the first response is saying, well, if that's true, if we're rebelling, then you wipe us out right now.
Yeah, their response, I think, is so
They're not trying to
profound.
steal their way out of this, but they're just explaining why it was done.
Yeah, they accept it, but you know what they do even before they accept the accusation or the consequences? They give glory to God. Look at that verse number 22. The mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, he knows. Listen, if we're talking about God's holiness, that's where we need to start. He knows. Let's put the glory and honor on him. This is not about what I think versus what you think. This is about honoring God, and he knows. And then you're exactly right. They accept these consequences. In conflict resolution, that's such an important element. Being willing to put your finger on things that are objective, that you can come to agreement on. Because basically what they're saying is, yes, I agree with you about the consequences. If what you're saying is true, then yes, we're guilty. And there are definite consequences that we agree with you on. You see, this is creating some common ground. It puts them in a very vulnerable position, might I add. But they are coming to terms and common ground here and all of this. There's a lot of value in acknowledging and affirming objective truths. I want you to notice their first response is they don't immediately expect their accusers to back down. Right? They don't say, no, here's our rationale, let us tell you. Instead, they agreed with the consequences, which helped everyone align with the purpose. What are we trying to accomplish here? We're trying to honor God. Man, if we could start in that place in our conversations, in that place in our arguments, when conflict happens, you think things would go a lot differently? I know they would, because that's God's pattern. That's God's pattern for conflict resolution. And so after that, after they give glory to God, they find some common ground. What rationale do they give? Why did they say they built this altar? Okay. There's some very profound things that they have to say. I want you to look at verse number 24. We'll just read this together and then talk about it. No, but we did it from fear that in time to come your children might say to our children, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you people of Reuben and the people of Gad. You have no portion in the Lord. So your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore, we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you and between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in his presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. I want you to notice just some really important things. To Jessica's point earlier, they make it very clear. We didn't make this to worship with. We didn't make this as an alternative to going to Jerusalem. We still believe in that. We're still going to worship God in his way. That is such an important thing here, because wasn't that one of Israel's the Western tribes? That was their biggest concern, right? You're going to quit worshiping God his way? No. Instead, we did it as a tool for teaching. I think the way you said it, they're looking to the future, right? They want their children to appreciate their identity. We are part of these people because we participated in the mission of God, and we travel back to Jerusalem because we are part of the people of God, and this is God's way. And yes, it's terribly inconvenient to travel over the Jordan, but we do it. And in the future, when future generations from the West say, you have no portion with us, they want them to have a legitimate reason, a legitimate place to go and say, no, but we are a part of you. We are a part of you. We want to be a part of you. And so they are concerned about their future. They're worried that their children are going to lose their connection to this identity that is so critical to their being, because they recognize if they are not the people of God, they have nothing. Do we appreciate that? If we do not have our identity as the people of God, the holy people of God, connected to his promises, connected to him through our worship, worshiping him his way, We are nothing. We are not the people of God if we do it any other way. They want to teach these things to their children. And so I want you to just appreciate with me the value of this man-made remembrance. God didn't commission this altar. I got that. And I'm not suggesting that it's the only way they could have done this, the right way to do it. But they did it on purpose. This man-made remembrance was intended to help future generations be faithful. And you know, the traditions that we have today within our church, they're no different than this, right? Older generations pass down traditions to younger generations in an effort to keep them faithful. And sometimes they constrain us in ways that the younger generation might not like. But we need to appreciate the value of what previous generations are passing down to us because they see things clearly that maybe we don't, right? This generation sees. In future generations, our children might not understand. They might lose this completely. We don't want them to lose something so critical and fundamental that they won't understand and appreciate as critical and fundamental. We face the same challenge today, and we need to appreciate. I especially want to talk to us younger people. I get in trouble for doing that a lot. I'm sorry. There is such value in what the previous generation passes down to us, in their traditions, in their patterns, that we need to be grateful for. We need to be grateful for. Sometimes it feels a little staunch, but sometimes that's exactly what's necessary. That's what we need. You know, this was something to try to help the future generations remain faithful. And I think that's why this conflict was resolved, because they realized these people are not trying to dishonor God. They are trying to maintain faithfulness, the very thing that Moses told us to do in Deuteronomy chapter 6, teach our children and our children's children, help them remain faithful. We are all in alignment about the holiness of God and the worship of God. We are all the same under God because of His holiness. And so I want you to also appreciate with me the fundamental thing that brought these people together. It wasn't opinions. It's the honor for God. It's the glory for God, right? The fact is, we're going to have differences of opinion about what that looks like, right? And those things are going to clash sometimes. But if we are doing our best to honor God, we're going to find peace and resolution and a way forward that keeps us unified and not divided. Because I can tell you, at the end of the day, Satan would love nothing more than for us to divide over stupid, silly little things that are matters of opinion. And he's done that far too many times in the Lord's church. Even in my lifetime, I've seen it. We are not going to be the kind of people that do that. Because if God's holiness and God's honor is important to us, then we will also recognize that unity and harmony under that is also important. And we'll work towards those things. Y'all see how that's being drawn out of here in Joshua chapter 22? They get to a place of resolution because they recognize this is all about honoring God. We're all on the same page about that. In fact, there's an important point in verse number 31 here where the Western tribes, they acknowledge you've committed no crime. We're all on the same page here. And they accept that. Whew. A lot of good lessons there. All right, we've got 2 more class periods. With the conquest complete and this conflict resolved, Israel's going to begin settling into their new home. But what more do they need, right? Well, we've got 2 more chapters in Joshua. We'll find out what more they need in the coming weeks. Thank you guys for your thoughts and comments this morning.